It's me again. Little House in the Big Woods. We're on chapter 11. This is called Harvest. I'm going to show you a picture. So, this picture, I don't know if that's supposed to be Pa or his brother, who's called Uncle Henry. Um, but he's got a tool in his hand. Laura calls it a cradle. I always called that a scythe. But I guess it's called a cradle because it also has a cradle on it. The tool has a long curved handle, and at the bottom it has a curved steel blade. You may be without the cradle. You may have seen pictures of the Grim Reaper, a symbol for death. They always have a guy in a big hood carrying that blade. But anyway, this is called a cradle, and it's got the lattice work. It's kind of like pieces of wood that have been kind of attached to each other. And so that when the grain, whether it be grass or wheat or oats or corn, when it's cut with this, you can lay the stalks, probably not corn, that'd be a little bit tall. You could lay it on the cradle and get a kind of a pile of them neatly laid there, and you could lay them off to the side so that you can organize them later, work with them later. Yeah, you see he's got that long curved handle, and he's got that other little part, and the way he would use it, it's a lot of work. And they're going to be working like about, I would say, a good 14 hours in the field this day. And they would take their whole body and they swing with it. And then they take their body and they swing with it. And then they take their body and they swing with it over and over and hundreds of times all day long in the heat. So I'm going to read it. Pa and Uncle Henry traded work. When the grain got ripe in the fields, Uncle Henry came to work with Pa, and Aunt Polly and the cousins came to spend the day. Then Pa went to help Uncle Henry cut his grain. I'll make sure this is recording. It is. And that's a terrible thought. And Ma took Laura and Mary and Carrie to spend the day with Aunt Polly. So they traded work. One helped one, and then the other one turned around and helped the first one. Ma and Aunt Polly worked in the house, and all day the cousins played together in the yard till dinner time. Aunt Polly's yard was a fine place to play because the stumps were so thick. The cousins played jumping from stump to stump without ever touching the ground. So by thick, Laura is saying not that each tree trunk was big around. She's saying there were so many trees that were so close together, they were thick. Even Laura, who was littlest, could do this easily in the places where the smallest trees had grown close together. Cousin Charlie was a big boy, going on 11 years old, and he could jump from stump to stump all over the yard. The smaller stumps he could jump two at a time, and he could walk on the top rail of the fence without being afraid. So I don't know if I explained this to you before, but this was all forest when they moved there, just solid woods, and they had to clear by hand with saws and axes. They had to clear all the trees that were there, so that they used them to make their house and they used them to make their fence, but they needed to clear them so that they could have a place to do work and live and plant crops. This whole thing is talking about, this whole chapter is talking about the importance of the crops. This is called subsistence farming. And it was like your ancestors did this in this country. They had to rely on themselves. There weren't very many people around that could help them. In this case, Pa and Uncle Henry and Grandpa kind of lived nearby each other, several miles apart, but still. But they had to take care of themselves. Everything they planted, they had to prepare the ground and plow it and everything. All this by hand and plant. And it's not like me going and buying 2 tomato plants. It's like everything they planted, they were careful with it. They tried to preserve it the best they could. They had to make it last about a year, or they wouldn't have anything to eat. That's basically what's going on here. So this grain is going to be important. They're going to use it for their horses. If their horses do not eat, and the snow, it's several feet tall, they won't have anything to eat over the winter. They might die. They need them to plow. They need them for transportation. They need the horses. So this is a big deal, what they're doing. This isn't just playtime. So, but the kids are playing and they're having a good time, which is fine. But yeah, I want you to see the importance of this. Pa and Uncle Henry were out in the field cutting the oats with cradles. A cradle was a sharp steel blade fastened to a framework of wooden slats that caught and held the stalks of grain when the blade cut them. Pa and Uncle Henry carried the cradles by their long curved handles and swung the blades into the standing oats. When they had cut enough to make a pile, they slid the cut stalks off the slats and into neat heaps on the ground. It was hard work, walking around and around the field in the hot sun, and with both hands swinging the heavy cradles into the grain and cutting it, then sliding it into piles. So I'm going to show you what they do with the piles. So they get like a neat stack of the stalks, so they know what they're doing. It saves them some time later. I figured out if I point to this first, it kind of helps a little. So I don't know which is which, Pa or Uncle Henry, but they're brothers. And where my finger's pointing, the man he's taken some of the stalks and twisted them together into a kind of a rope or a cord. And he's tying or binding the bundle with it. And then he tucks the ends of the cord that he made into, underneath. And the other guy is, when you get 7 of them, it's going to explain it. When you get 7 of these, they're going to make something into it's called a shock. And it's the same word as when you're walking around sliding your feet on carpet while you're wearing socks in the winter when the air's dry and you can touch somebody and shock them. It's spelled the same way, but it has a different meaning. It's like the shape is going to be like a giant teepee. And it's made out of corn a lot of times. You'll see it like in the fall. People decorate with it now. Something that we needed. I mean, since years ago, we would have needed it for our survival. We just use it as decoration now. I think that's kind of interesting. But anyway, so they'll have it all together so that the grain can dry. They'll have 5 bundles close together, standing like a triangle shape if you look at it from a distance. And then they'll use 2 more bundles as like a rooftop. And they have to keep the grain from getting wet. This is why they do this, to dry it out. And they don't have a big barn to lay it out flat and let it dry. I mean, they have a barn, but not big enough for a whole crop. And the reason they want to dry it is because mold or mildew could ruin it. I mean, some kinds of mold and mildew in different kinds of grain can even be poisonous. So all that work, they don't want to waste it after all that hard work, especially since they absolutely have to have it to help them survive. So I'm going to read the steps that I just showed the illustration for. After all the grain was cut, they must go over the field again. This time they would stoop over each pile and taking up a handful of the stalks in each hand, they would knot them together to make a longer strand. That was what I was telling you. Then gathering up the pile of grain in their arms, they would bind it tightly around with a band they had made and tie the band and tuck in its ends. After they had made 7 such bundles, then the bundles must be shocked. To make a shock, they stood 5 bundles upright, snugly together with the oat heads up. Then over these they put 2 more bundles, spreading out the stalks to make a little roof and shelter the 5 bundles from the dew and rain. Every stalk of the grain must always be safely in the shock before dark, for lying on the dewy ground all night would spoil it. Pa and Uncle Henry were working very hard because the air was so heavy and hot and still that they expected rain. And I don't know, you probably had that experience where you go out and the moisture in the air, it makes it feel so heavy. It's just saturated with moisture. It's the humidity is what they call it. And a lot of times it rains after that. I mean, just the air is just, you can just feel the moisture in it. The oats were ripe, and if they were not cut and in the shock before rain came, the crop would be lost. Then Uncle Henry's horses would go hungry all winter, or would be hungry all winter. At noon, Pa and Uncle Henry came to the house in a hurry and swallowed their dinner as quickly as they could. Uncle Henry said that Charlie must help them that afternoon. Laura looked at Pa when Uncle Henry said that. At home, Pa had said to Ma that Uncle Henry and Aunt Polly spoiled Charlie. When Pa was 11 years old, he had done a good day's work every day in the fields driving a team, like a team of horses or oxen. But Charlie did hardly any work at all. Now Uncle Henry said that Charlie must come to the field. He could save them a great deal of time. He could go to the spring for water. That's one thing he could do. He could fetch them the water jug when they needed a drink. He could fetch the whetstone when the blades needed sharpening. 3 lousy things they're asking him to do. 3 things. I want to show you the word whetstone. My finger's pointing to it. Whetstone. A whetstone, it's got an H in it. You see that? It sounds just like a wet stone, but in this case, it's one word, and it's a real hard kind of rock, and it's made into. This is a rectangular prism. It's got it's like a rectangle this way, but it's a prism because it's got a third dimension. So this is a rectangular prism. I've seen them about this long, about that wide, and about that thick. And you use them to sharpen blades like knives and axes and scythes. You can use them to sharpen swords. People would sharpen their blades with them. You can also ruin a blade if you don't know what you're doing. So it's a real specific thing. All the children looked at Charlie. I wanted to say too, like if you're ever cut paper with really dull scissors, you would know why it's important if they're going to be working with their whole bodies all day long, swinging that they have a sharp blade. It makes it easier. Still a lot of work. All the children looked at Charlie. Charlie did not want to go to the field. He wanted to stay in the yard and play. Who could blame him? But of course he did not say so. Pa and Uncle Henry did not rest at all. They ate in a hurry and went right back to work, and Charlie went with them. Now Mary was oldest, and she wanted to play a quiet, ladylike play. So in the afternoon, the cousins made a playhouse in the yard. The stumps were chairs and tables and stoves, and leaves were dishes, and sticks were the children. On the way home that night, Laura and Mary heard Pa tell Ma what happened in the field. Okay, so Laura Ingalls Wilder made a decision. She decided to have the story unfold in a certain way. She could have had it so that you're going to see something that's going to be in real time for Laura, but instead she went ahead and told the background of the story so that when you're going to see this interesting thing that maybe horrified them, you're going to see what had happened. So it's kind of an interesting storytelling idea that she had. The way the story is being told, it's like we're watching a movie to me. Like we're off in the background watching what's going on with all these people. We don't know exactly what they think, but we know what they're saying. And what they're doing with each other. But we're just kind of observing. We have no way to interact with them, right? It's kind of a neat thing. Okay, so here's the story she got that night when they were riding home, when everything was done with the day. Instead of helping Pa and Uncle Henry, not Uncle Charlie, Charlie was making all the trouble he could. He got in their way so they couldn't swing the cradles. So think about how dangerous that is. If somebody is using all their might and in a hurry and cutting with this blade over and over, and you just and try running in front of it, So he did that. So they had to stop what they did real quick so they didn't chop his legs. Um, he got out of he got in their way. He hid the whetstone. That was one of his jobs, is to bring it in when they needed it. But instead, he hid it from them. So they had to hunt for it when the blades needed sharpening. He didn't bring the water jug until Uncle Henry shouted at him 3 or 4 times, and then he was sullen. Like, oh, you don't have to be so hateful about it, was what he was thinking. I doubt he said it. Maybe he said it. After that, he followed them around, talking and asking questions. They were working too hard to pay any attention to him, so they told him to go away and not bother them. But they dropped their cradles and ran to him across the field when they heard him scream. The woods were all around the field, and there were snakes in the oats. Snakes don't eat oats, but they eat mice, and mice eat oats. And some snakes wouldn't harm you. I mean, they'd bite you, that would hurt, but they don't have venom in them. Some snakes do have venom, and that would be a bad thing. When they got to Charlie, there was nothing wrong, and he laughed at them. He said, I fooled you that time. There's a story. I'm going to tell you a story. There's a story. It's called The Boy Who Cried Wolf. You may know this story. It's an old folk tale or legend. And in the story, there's a boy who is a shepherd. He's in charge of guarding sheep from any trouble, keeping them all together, and keeping them safe, because people rely on the sheep to have wool, and also that I'm sure they ate them from time to time. But anyway, they're a valuable commodity for them. So this boy decides it's a funny thing to do to yell wolf in terror and make all the townspeople come to his rescue. But there was no wolf. And it made all the people mad. They dropped everything they were doing to come to him, and they didn't want to be fooled, tricked that way. It's not funny. So when the wolf really did come later, nobody came when he yelled. So this kind of reminds me of that. Charlie, he does need a spanking, if you ask me. Pa said that if he had been Uncle Henry, he would have tanned the boy's hide for him right then and there. But Uncle Henry did not do it. Remember, Charlie spoiled for some reason. So they took a drink of water and went back to work. 3 times Charlie screamed, and they ran to him as fast as they could, and he laughed at them. He thought it was a good joke, and still Uncle Henry did not tan his hide. Then a 4th time he screamed louder than ever. Pa and Uncle Henry looked at him, and he was jumping up and down screaming. They saw nothing wrong with him, and they had been fooled so many times that they went on with their work. I don't blame them. Charlie kept on screaming louder and shriller. Pa did not say anything. Parents don't really give advice to other parents about how to raise their kids. So Pa's not doing that, especially then. But Pa did not say anything, but Uncle Henry said, let him scream. So they went on working and let him scream. He kept on jumping up and down and screaming. He did not stop. At last, Uncle Henry said, maybe something really is wrong. They laid down their cradles and went across the field to him. Something really was wrong. Can you see what's happening? These are called yellow jackets. They're related to, I guess, hornets, maybe. They're not exactly a bee, but they're in that similar family. They live underground in these little long tunnels under the ground, and they have an entrance way and an exit way somewhat other direction. And if you just step on them, sometimes you can get away with it, step on the nest, but they feel the vibrations and they're thinking they're being attacked. If you kind of stay there, or if the next 2 or 3 people come and walk right in the same spot, they will start attacking. And how they attack is they go up inside your clothes and they sting you, and they continue stinging you because they don't die like a honeybee does. They keep stinging and stinging and stinging. They're trying to protect themselves, to be fair to them. It's not very fun. And if you're really allergic to that kind of venom, it could be dangerous. And especially if you get stung a lot. He's getting stung a lot. Um, and all that time, Charlie had been jumping up and down on a yellow jacket's nest. The yellow jackets lived in a nest on the ground, and Charlie stepped on it by mistake. Then all the little bees with their bright yellow jackets came swarming out with their red hot stings, and they hurt Charlie so that he couldn't get away. He was jumping up and down, and hundreds of bees were stinging him all over. They were stinging his face and his hands and his neck and his nose and his nose. They were crawling up his pants legs and stinging, and crawling down the back of his neck and stinging. The more he jumped and screamed, the harder they stung. Pa and Uncle Henry took him by the arms and ran him away from the Yellow Jackets' nest. They undressed him, and his clothes were full of yellow jackets, and their stings were swelling up all over him. They killed the bees that were stinging him, and they shook the bees out of his clothes, and they dressed him again and sent him to the house. I imagine they got stung a lot too. Laura and Mary and the cousins were playing quietly in the yard when they heard a loud, blubbering cry. So now they're getting to see. This is what I was talking about. They're getting to see. She's telling the background of what she's getting to see now. Charlie came bawling into the yard, and his face was so swollen that the tears could hardly squeeze out of his eyes. His hands were puffed up, and his neck was puffed out, and his cheeks were big, hard puffs. His fingers stood out stiff and swollen. There were little hard white dents all over his puffed out face and neck. Laura and Mary and the cousins stood and looked at him. Ma and Aunt Polly came running out of the house and asked him what was the matter. Charlie blubbered and bawled. That kind of bawl is BAWLED, bawled. It means, crying. Ma said it was Yellow Jackets. She ran to the garden and got a big pan of earth, garden dirt. While Aunt Polly took Charlie into the house and undressed him. They made a big pan full of mud and plastered him all over with it. That was a smart thing to do. If you ever get stung by something, of course, let your parents know. But something that I've done before, and other people that I know have done, you just get dirt out of the ground, and you could even spit in it and put it on there. When it dries, it pulls some of the, it dries your skin. It also pulls some of the venom out. That's one thing you could do. But they rolled him up in an old sheet and put him to bed. His eyes were swollen shut, and his nose was a funny shape. Ma and Aunt Polly covered his whole face with mud and tied the mud on with cloths. Only the end of his nose and mouth showed. Aunt Polly steeped some herbs, that's spelled Herbs, herbs, and it's something, if you know what you're doing, you can use it for medicine, different kinds of leaves and plants. Don't play around with it. I mean, people have to know what they're doing. But so she steeped some herbs. That means soak them in hot water, like tea. You steep tea leaves to give him for his fever. Laura and Mary and the cousins stood around for some time looking at him. Oh, and here's the picture. Oh, it's very impressive. So that's the picture. See his little nose and mouth? Yeah. Laura's the littlest kid. Yeah, poor Charlie. I kind of feel sorry for him. But holy cow. It was dark that night when Pa and Uncle Henry came from the field. All the oats were in the shock, and now the rain could come and it would not do any harm. Pa could not stay to supper. He had to get home and do the milking. The cows were already waiting at home, and when cows are not milked on time, they do not give so much milk. He hitched up quickly, and they all got into the wagon. So even though he's worked hard all day, he's still got a bunch of chores to do when he gets home. Pa was very tired, and his hands ached so that he could not drive very well. But the horses knew the way home. He can't even hold on to the reins. Ma sat beside him with baby Carrie, and Laura and Mary sat on the board behind them. Then they heard Pa tell about what Charlie had done. So this is how this is where she heard the whole story. Laura and Mary were horrified. They were often naughty themselves, but they had never imagined that anyone could be as naughty as Charlie had been. He hadn't worked to help save the oats. He hadn't minded his father quickly when his father spoke to him. He had bothered Pa and Uncle Henry when they were hard at work. Then Pa told about the Yellow Jacket's nest, and he said, "It served the little liar right." After she was in the trundle bed that night, Laura lay and listened to the rain drumming on the roof and streaming down the eaves. And she thought about what Pa had said. She thought about what the Yellow Jackets had done to Charlie. She thought it served Charlie right, too. It served him right because he had been so monstrously naughty, and the bees had a right to sting him when he jumped on their home. But she didn't understand why Pa had called him a little liar. She didn't understand how Charlie could be a liar when he had not said a word. He hadn't said a word and he was a liar. I wonder why that is. That's what I want you to think about and tell me how he could be a liar when he did not say anything that was a lie. So, I love you all.